One of my favorite things to happen in any media I'm engaged with is when I'm able to catch a glimpse of art imitating life in some fashion, especially as it pertains to the examination of the story therein. And I do think this is shown quite brilliantly well in its rivalry, especially as it pertains to the subversion of assumptions, which we see play out with the characters in the show and also with we, the audience, who are watching said show. And what can I say? I personally think it's utterly delicious when you dig into that particular theme, hence why I am making this very video. You're welcome. Now, before I dive into the many characters and instances that really do show off why and how this theme plays off well within the story, I would first like to say a big thank you to my lovely patrons and YouTube members whose support have been instrumental in helping me continue to make content, especially since I started doing this full time at the start of last year, which was the last time I was in paid employment. And a special shout out to Lena, Sherry, Holly, and Kat for their extra support. You get all the hearts and kisses too. Mwah. If you too would like to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to enjoy certain perks, maybe even get a shout out, the link to do so is in the description bar. And with that said, back to the subversion of assumptions, which is something that has stuck with me since back in episode 2 when Katavon is in Sochi with Scott and Shane and they are digging into ice cream, where a break in the discussion after talking about the Russian team and the burden of failure, of that failure, and how it would have landed on Ilya. Shane, in his desire to change the topic, brings up wanting to sit in and support a friend that is competing in the short form figure skating category for men. Vonnie immediately is all down for that because he's an ally TM, and he considers it very brave that Shane's friend, who he already automatically assumes is gay by virtue of the fact that he's a figure skater, is able to show up for himself in a way, in a place as hostile to queer people as Russia is. I found it very interesting because that conversation is happening right in the middle of two gay hockey players that Vonnie has no idea about. In fact, he's doing the one thing that a lot of people in their sport do, which is to fall on the default assumption that they are straight, even though it's not really something he's very conscious he's doing. And so, whilst he's working with that assumption, it makes another based off of the perception everybody has about male figure skaters and the default that is the belief that majority of them are gay. It's such a great scene that speaks to the subversion of assumptions. Firstly, because if you pay close attention to the dialogue, Shane never actually confirms whether or not Vonnie's assumption about his friend is correct or not. He starts to say, I mean, and Von cuts him off to extol the bravery inherent in being able to show up as yourself in a country that would see you penalized for being yourself. We never get confirmation about whether or not that assumption is correct. But what we do know for certain in the episode, and then later on in episode 3, when the scene is repeated, is the fact that while Shane's body Joe may or may not be gay, and Vaughn is merely assuming that he is, Shane and Scott are actually gay, and Vaughn assumes that they are not. Of course, it doesn't make him any less of an ally when Scott does come out to him. I mean, that's something I really enjoyed in the books because Carter Vaughn is a sweetheart who is absolutely vocal about how proud he is of his captain and his excitement to meet said captain's boyfriend. But yeah, an ally he is for sure. But in that moment, he affirmed that making assumptions is a default a lot of us do subconsciously, and sometimes those assumptions blind us to the truth that is right in front of us. And we see this play out as well with Ilya and his father Grigory. We all ascertain that Gregory is a verbally abusive piece of shit father to Ilya, but at the same time, I keep rewatching the scene, especially after the draft and Ilya's meeting with the GM of the Boston Raiders for the first time in the company of his father. And that dialogue sticks with me a lot because here you have Ilya wanting to put in a good first impression, and Gregory mouths off about how Ilya lacks discipline because he is lazy. Now, the GM immediately dismisses that, stating that he very much doubts that Ilya is lazy, which Ilya echoes by making the promise to work very hard for him. And whilst I, like a lot of the viewers, wanted to throttle Gregory in that scene for attempting to diminish his son in the presence of his boss, I did wonder if that wasn't Gregory working under false assumptions as well. You see, society has conditioned us to see hard work, perseverance, and diligence in one light. When someone takes something seriously, the expectation is to see them throw themselves wholeheartedly into it. I don't think, for example, that anyone would look at how utterly devoted Shane is to hockey, where he basically lives and breathes it to the point that he's studying up on hockey books at night during their off season when everyone else is out having fun. I don't think anyone else would look at Shane and think to ever apply the word lazy to him. Gregory would not be able to do so. Matter of fact, if not for the sheer competitiveness that drives him, I do think that Grigory Rozanov might even have been impressed with Shane. Because that discipline that Shane brings to himself and his application of himself to the sport is what Grigory wishes that Ilya has. And so, because Ilya, whilst he being bloody damn good at the sport, is able to have a good time regardless, Grigory works with the assumption that Ilya is not taking things seriously, an assumption that we know to be false because Ilya does express the fact that hockey has always been his escape, something that Grigory cannot compute. I sometimes look at Ilya and his father's interactions through the lens of a gifted student who didn't spend 24 hours of my own life buried in my school books, and how that had colored the perception others had towards me about me getting on talent and not necessarily hard work. And honestly, I can imagine the same with Ilya. We, of course, know that this is false. Ilya Rozanov cannot be the generational talent that he is without putting in the work. But I'm pretty sure that there are those within the universe of the story who probably think that he's coasting on by, that he isn't putting 100% of himself into play. I wonder if that is not also behind him mentioning to Shane that he's lazy, because that is something he's heard repeated a lot with regards himself and not just from his father. Of course, Shane immediately counters that by saying that he doesn't know that side of Ilya at all, to which Ilya smiles. And I really like that because it just goes to show that even with how Ilya plays, he's still turning the assumptions others have about him on its heads. The great thing about the subversion of assumption as a theme is that as readers, especially readers who are aware of the layers that the characters within the story have no idea about, is that we get to see further into said story, into the bits of it that isn't readily known to the other characters. For example, in Universe, everyone's assumption about Ilya Rozanov is that he's an asshole. It's how he's portrayed and marketed himself, is the persona he slaps on when he's on the ice and doing interviews. And so therefore, a lot of people who don't actually know him tend to take that part of him at face value. But we know that Ilya Rozanov is conscientious, he cares deeply, and uses his asshole persona as a mask with which he navigates their world. Without the mask, he's so much more. He's playful, he's funny, he's loyal, he's great with kids. These are qualities that a lot of people would not think would apply to Ilya in their world, and yet it's a great way to highlight his characterization as directly foiling the assumptions others have about who he is and the kind of person he tends to be around those he loves and when he lets down his guard. Ilya is an asshole, yes, but Ilya is the asshole you want in your corner. Now, we don't get to see a lot of it in the first season because Olanov's first book is centered around Shane and Ilya finding their way to being honest about their feelings and not needing to mask who they actually are around each other and around those who matter to them. But by the time we get to the rest of the books in the series, however, especially Role Model and The Long Game, and we get to spend even more time with Ilya, our assumptions that we'd had prior to reading those books are utterly shattered. It has me positively giddy for season two, and I'm not going to spoil that for those of you who haven't read the books yet. Just know that we get to see things turn on their heads, not just for Ilya and Shane, but also for characters like Troy and hell, even Ryan as well. God, I hope we get to see Ryan Price in season two. Please, Jacob, come through for me. But back to assumptions, like I stated at the start with Vonnie, there's the fact that the default expectation for hockey players is that they are straight, which is something that Shane and Ilya challenge right out the bat, and which then bleeds into another major assumption on the part of the characters in universe, which is the fact that their deeply held belief is that Shane and Ilya must have a contentious relationship because of the rivalry that has dogged at their heels since their rookie season. Hell, we know how deep this goes because even Shane's parents are shocked when they learn the truth. Not just about the fact that Shane and Ilya are together, but because of how long their sexual and romantic relationship has existed. The continuous echo of since their rookie season is them trying to wrap their head around everything they thought and assumed as it pertains to Shane and Ilya. They have to mentally rework the interactions that they had been so quick to dismiss as being based off of a mutual dislike due to Shane and Ilya's rivalry, and now they have to read it as something more because there has been something more. They just never saw it because they assumed otherwise. That's what makes subversion in this case so interesting to me because it then rewrites instances and situations that people are taking for granted and as a safe bet as something more when you realize that there's so much more going on than you expected. And of course, this doesn't just apply to the characters in the show, but to we, the audience, as well. I recall trying to get some friends into watching the show, and their knee jerk reaction was to be dismissive of it as, oh, that's that gay show, that's basically porn, which is funny because Jacob Tierney, in filming the sex scenes, definitely worked with an eye to tweak his nose at the audience because the assumption a lot of people have when they catch glimpses of the sex scenes is that it's a very raunchy show, which is false. It's actually working with we, the audience, filling in the gap mentally because the sex scenes are so very tastefully shot. There isn't any sort of frontal nudity or gratuitous framing. Instead, it's hints at movement that viewers then fill in the blanks to think sex. Like Jacob doesn't show us, he just hints at us and lets us fill in the gaps. And because of that, word got around, and everyone immediately casted the show in the light of, oh, it's basically porn, which is false and an assumption. But at the same time, even if it is, which it isn't, by the way, but even if it is, who cares? As long as children aren't watching it, it's okay in my book. But most importantly, Game of Thrones had way more explicit scenes than Heated Rivalry does, and you don't see people calling it porn. But also, the initial categorization of heated rivalry as merely being porn then changes again when viewers get more invested, watch more episodes, and the story, which had initially lured us in with more explicit content, mellows out to focus on the emotional part of the show itself, gradually highlighting how these characters went from merely fucking to falling in love in the course of almost a decade, which then turns the show into so much more than the initial assumption about it that a large part of the audience had going into it. And it's such a great reflection of how things played out within the show as well, where people's assumptions about a character, for example, turns out to be nothing like they had thought when they got to know said characters more, or when they are privy to more information that turns everything they thought they knew about these people or about this person on its head. It's bloody brilliant work. But of course, these are just my thoughts. I would, as always, love to hear yours. Whether or not you agree with me, please share them in the comments, especially if you like to point out even more instances of subverting assumptions that we got within the show. I know I did not cover all of them. Like this video, however, if you've watched this far and haven't done so yet, but enjoyed anything of what I had to say, share it so others can find my channel as well. Or you can check out my gaming or ASMR channels if they sound like something you might potentially possibly be interested in. I have them both linked in the description bar. I will see you tomorrow with a new video. Until then, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.